I never imagined that my life would change forever on that fateful day in September 1989. One moment, I was driving down the road, the world around me a blur of motion and sound. The next, everything shattered. The impact of the crash was sudden and violent. Then, silence. A deep, endless silence. I later learned that I had been clinically dead for 8 minutes, but in those moments I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't gone. Instead, I found myself in a place that defied time and space, a realm so vivid and overwhelming that it felt more real than anything I had ever known. At first, I was aware of myself but disconnected from my body. I could see the wreckage below, my broken form lying still as paramedics rushed to my side. Yet I felt no pain, no fear, only a strange sense of detachment, as if I had been gently lifted from the burdens of my earthly existence. Then, without warning, everything around me shifted. A tunnel of radiant light appeared before me, pulling me forward with a force that wasn't physical but deeply magnetic. It wasn't just light. It was love, pure and unconditional, wrapping around me like the warmest embrace. The farther I moved, the more I became aware of something greater than myself. A presence, a power. And as I drifted further from the world I had known, the veil between the ordinary and the divine lifted, revealing a realm I had never believed possible. I never expected to witness what I saw in those moments between life and death. Floating above the wreckage of my broken body, I felt neither pain nor fear. Instead, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of peace, a stillness that was unlike anything I had ever known. But it wasn't just peace. I was seeing things I could never have imagined in my earthly life. As I gazed down at the scene below, I saw the flashing lights of ambulances and the desperate movements of the first responders working frantically to save me. Their voices were urgent, calling out instructions, administering aid. I should have felt panicked, but instead I was mesmerized by something else, something otherworldly. Angels. They moved effortlessly among the chaos, unseen by the living but undeniably present. They weren't the winged beings of Renaissance paintings, but radiant, luminous figures, their presence vibrating with an energy I could feel deep in my soul. They glided through the scene with purpose, touching certain individuals with a brilliance that was almost blinding. I watched, transfixed, as one angel extended a hand toward a paramedic who was performing CPR on my lifeless body. The moment the angel's light touched him, a mark appeared, a radiant glow that pulsed from deep within his chest. It wasn't visible to anyone but me, but it was undeniable. He had been marked. I turned my gaze, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The angels were deliberate, moving through the crowd of emergency workers, bystanders, and even those who had just stopped to watch. Some received the glowing mark, while others did not. It had nothing to do with uniforms or status, nothing to do with titles or outward appearances. Instead, the markings seemed to be placed upon those with something deeper, something intrinsic that I could not yet fully grasp. Then, I saw him. A man, ragged and unkempt, stood at the edge of the chaos. His clothes were tattered, his face weathered with years of hardship. A homeless man. No one was paying attention to him. No one even seemed to notice his presence, but I did. He had his hands clasped together, his lips moving in silent prayer. Though the world ignored him, he was praying, not for himself, but for me, for the strangers around him, for the souls he did not know but still cared for. And then, just as I had seen before, an angel approached him. Without hesitation, the celestial being reached out and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Instantly, he was illuminated, his chest glowing with the same divine mark. It was breathtaking, humbling. This was not about wealth or power. This was about the heart. My gaze followed another angel as it moved toward an elderly woman standing a few feet away. She was frail, her hands shaking as she clutched a small, worn Bible to her chest. Her lips trembled as she whispered the words of the Lord's Prayer, her voice nearly drowned out by the noise of sirens and frantic shouts. And yet, she prayed. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in trust. An angel knelt beside her, pressing a hand over her heart, and the same beautiful glow spread across her body. She, too, had been marked. I was overwhelmed. I had always thought that faith was measured by devotion to religious practices, by attendance in churches, by sermons preached and doctrines followed. But here, in this space between life and death, I saw the truth so clearly. The angels were not marking those with prestigious titles or religious influence. They were marking those who truly loved, those who carried faith deep within them, not as a performance, but as a part of their very being. It was then that I realized the terrifying and beautiful weight of this knowledge. The marks were not for show. They were real, visible to the spiritual realm, a testament to the connection between these souls and God Himself. And as I watched the angels continue their work, I found myself wondering, had I been marked? Just when I thought I had surrendered completely to the presence before me, my awareness expanded even further, unveiling sights that transcended anything I had ever known. I will never forget what I saw in that place between life and death. It wasn't just the overwhelming love, the peace, or even the angels moving among us. It was something far more profound, something I had never imagined possible. As I hovered above the wreckage of my own body, watching the first responders work desperately to bring me back, my attention shifted beyond them. What I saw then changed everything I thought I knew about faith, about prayer, and about the connections that bind us across time. The marked individuals, the ones the angels had touched with that radiant divine light, were not isolated souls, standing alone in their faith. They were connected, and not just in spirit, but by something tangible, something I could see with my own eyes. Golden threads of light extended from each marked person, stretching outward in every direction, weaving an intricate, breathtaking web across time and space. These threads pulsed gently, carrying something invisible yet deeply powerful. I followed them with my eyes, watching as they intertwined, some threads growing thicker and more vibrant, while others seemed faint, barely glowing. I understood in an instant. These were not just random markings. These were connections. Every person marked by the angels was linked to others who had also carried faith, love, and kindness in their souls. The golden threads were bonds, woven through generations, tracing back to ancestors who had prayed, who had believed, who had lived their lives in devotion to something greater than themselves. It was as if I were watching faith itself being passed down, carried forward through time by the people who chose to embrace it, nurture it, and share it with others. I turned my gaze toward one of the first responders, the paramedic who had been marked with the angelic glow. A golden thread extended from him, stretching back through time, connecting him to an old woman in a dimly lit home, decades earlier, kneeling beside a small child, whispering prayers over him as he slept. His grandmother. She had prayed for him before he was even old enough to understand the weight of those prayers. And now, here he was, years later, carrying that same mark, linked forever to her unwavering faith. I followed another thread, watching as it connected the homeless man, the one I had seen praying for me, to a stranger in another city, a woman he had never met. The thread pulsed with light as the woman miles away bowed her head in prayer, unknowingly strengthening the very bond that connected them. I saw how acts of kindness, even the smallest ones, created ripples. A father teaching his daughter to pray, a teacher encouraging a struggling student, a neighbor offering comfort to someone in need. All of these moments wove together into something larger than themselves. Every act of faith, every sincere prayer, every choice to love rather than hate, it all mattered. The angels moved among these threads, their hands lightly brushing over them, reinforcing some, strengthening others. I realized then that faith was never meant to be an individual journey. We were never alone in our belief. It was something shared, something carried through lifetimes, through bloodlines, through the unseen connections that tied us all together. One angel turned toward me then, and though no words were spoken, I understood the message perfectly. This is how faith survives. The voice resonated within me. It is not only in the hearts of the faithful, but in the legacy they leave behind. I thought about my own life, my own choices. Had I lived in a way that would create these golden threads? Had I nurtured faith in others, strengthened the connections between generations, carried forward the love that had been passed down to me? Or had I let my thread grow dim? The realization was both humbling and overwhelming. Everything mattered. Every choice to be kind, to believe, to pray. It all added to this beautiful, intricate network of faith spanning across time. I looked again at the elderly woman who had been marked as she whispered the Lord's Prayer. I saw her thread stretching back, linking her to a young boy kneeling beside his bed decades ago. His mother's hand resting on his shoulder as she guided him through his first prayer. That boy had grown into a man, carrying her teachings, passing them on to his own children. And now, here she was, in the final years of her life, still praying, still believing, still keeping the connection alive for those who would come after her. Tears filled my eyes. Faith wasn't just a personal experience. It was a gift, a responsibility, a thread in a much greater tapestry than I had ever realized. It was meant to be nurtured, protected, shared, not hoarded or hidden away. As I pondered the weight of faith and the legacy it wove through time, my eyes were drawn to something even greater, a revelation that would forever alter my understanding of the divine. I will never forget the moment I saw it. The divine book, vast and radiant, stretching beyond the limits of my vision. It was not made of paper or ink, but of living light, shimmering with a brilliance unlike anything on earth. The mere sight of it filled me with awe, an overwhelming sense that I was standing before something eternal, something sacred beyond comprehension. As I stood in that space between life and death, surrounded by the presence of angels and the golden threads connecting the marked souls, my attention was drawn to this magnificent book. It pulsed as if it were alive, each page turning with a whisper that echoed through my being, carrying the weight of endless stories. Lives lived, choices made, faith embraced or abandoned. I stepped closer, my soul drawn to its glow. When I looked at the pages, I saw names, countless names, etched in divine light. Some shone so brightly they seemed to burn with an inner fire, their radiance pulsating with the unmistakable presence of God's love. These were the souls who had been truly transformed, those who had allowed faith to reshape them, to refine them, to make them more than they once were. But as my gaze moved across the book, I noticed something else. Some names were dim, their light flickering like a dying ember. I felt a deep sadness in my heart as I looked at them, sensing the struggle, the wandering, the moments when these souls had turned away from the light that once guided them. Yet, despite their dim glow, they were still there. Not one name had been erased. This realization struck me with a force greater than anything I had felt before. I had always thought of faith as something that could be lost entirely, as if a person could simply fall too far, break too many times, or make too many wrong choices to ever find their way back. But that was not the truth. The truth was here, before my very eyes, written in this sacred book. Even those who had strayed were never forgotten. Their names remained, their stories still unfolding, their connection to God never truly severed. I felt the presence of something greater, something boundless, forgiving, and eternal, whispering to me, "My love does not fade. My love does not erase." Tears welled in my eyes as I thought of my own life, my own moments of doubt and failure. How many times had I let my faith flicker like those dim names? How many times had I turned away, questioning, fearing, running from what I knew to be true? And yet, even in my weakest moments, my name had not been removed. I watched as an angel passed a gentle hand over one of the dim names, and instantly, the light grew stronger. It was as if a breath of divine grace had reignited something deep within that soul. It was not too late for them. It was not too late for any of us. Transformation was still possible. I felt a stirring deep within me, a longing to be one of the names that burned brightly in that book, to live in such a way that my light could never be dimmed. But I also understood something even greater. God's love was not measured by brightness alone. His love remained even in the dimmest lights, even in those who had stumbled. His love was not a reward for perfection, but a promise of redemption. The book was not just a record. It was a living testament to the never-ending grace that flowed from God to his people. And as I stood in the presence of that sacred book, my heart still trembling from the weight of its truth, something new began to stir around me. Something just as profound, just as divine. It was then that I saw it. The power of prayer made visible. I never truly understood the power of prayer until I saw it with my own eyes. Growing up, I had always been told that prayer mattered, that our words reached beyond this world and touched something greater. But in the busyness of life, it had often felt like a ritual, something I did because I was supposed to, not because I truly believed in its power. That changed the moment I left my body and stepped into the realm where the unseen became visible. Hovering above the wreckage of my own body, I saw not just the physical world, but the spiritual one that existed alongside it. And what I saw left me in awe. It started as a flicker, like fireflies in the night. Small streaks of golden light rising from different places on Earth, each one moving upward, gathering into streams that connected to something beyond my vision. I watched, transfixed, as these streaks of light intertwined and formed vast, glowing pathways stretching across the heavens. These weren't random lights. They were prayers. Living, breathing, powerful. I followed one of the pathways with my eyes and saw angels moving along them, gliding effortlessly through the golden currents of faith. It was then that I realized something extraordinary. Prayers weren't just words spoken into the air. They were tangible, real, forming bridges between heaven and earth. The angels didn't just hear prayers, they traveled along them, using them as conduits to bring guidance, comfort, and protection. I was stunned. How many times had I prayed, never truly believing anything would happen? How many times had I dismissed answered prayers as mere coincidences? Yet here, in this divine space, I saw the truth. Nothing was random. Every prayer spoken with sincerity sent out ripples, shaping reality in ways I had never imagined. I turned my gaze downward toward the earth and saw a mother kneeling beside her child's bed, whispering a prayer of protection over him. The moment she spoke, a beam of golden light shot upward, and I followed its path as an angel descended along it. The angel stood beside the child, placing a hand over him, surrounding him with an unseen shield of divine energy. The mother would never know what had just occurred, never see how her whispered words had invited heaven itself into her child's room. But it was real. I watched as another prayer rose. This time, a prayer of thanksgiving. An elderly man sat alone in his small home, eyes closed, whispering gratitude for the simple meal before him. His prayer wasn't a request. It was a song of praise, a humble acknowledgement of God's goodness. As his words ascended, they didn't just create a pathway, they strengthened the entire spiritual atmosphere around him. I could see it. The very air shimmered, infused with a warmth that seemed to expand outward, affecting everyone nearby. Praise, I realized, was not just for the one speaking. It radiated outward, affecting everything in its path, strengthening the bonds between heaven and earth. But the most astonishing thing was how the angels used these prayers to orchestrate what humans often dismissed as mere coincidences. I was shown a scene of a man driving home late at night. He was exhausted, his eyelids heavy, his mind foggy with fatigue. Just as his car drifted toward oncoming traffic, an angel intervened, nudging him ever so slightly, just enough to startle him awake. He jerked the wheel, correcting his course just in time. To him, it would feel like a random moment of awareness, but I saw the truth. Someone had prayed for him. Somewhere, a loved one had whispered a plea for his safety, and that prayer had given the angel the means to act. I saw another moment. A woman about to step into a crosswalk, unaware of the speeding truck barreling toward her. Just before she took that final step, she dropped her keys. It was such a small thing, an inconvenience at most, but bending down to pick them up delayed her just enough for the truck to pass safely in front of her. To her, it would seem like chance. But I saw the angel who had caused it, standing beside her, answering a prayer she didn't even know had been said for her. How many times had I experienced such moments? The time I had narrowly avoided an accident. The time I had chosen a different path home and later learned of danger in the place I would have been. How often had I dismissed these things as luck, never once considering that they were answers to prayers. Prayers I had never even heard. Tears filled my eyes as I realized how connected we all were. The prayers of the marked ones, the ones who carried faith in their hearts, weren't just for themselves. They were for the world, for strangers they would never meet, for generations yet to come. And then I thought of my own life. Had I prayed enough? Had I ever truly believed in the power of my words? How many moments had passed where I could have lifted someone up in prayer but had instead remained silent, doubting that it would make a difference? But I knew now. I knew the truth. Prayer was never wasted. Every word spoken in faith, in love, in gratitude. It all mattered. It shaped reality, created pathways for divine intervention, and strengthened the very fabric of the world. And with this newfound understanding, another truth unfolded before me, one that would forever change the way I saw suffering. I never truly understood the purpose of suffering until I stood on the edge of life and death, seeing the world as it truly was. Not just the physical reality I had known, but the unseen forces at work, weaving through every moment, every struggle, every tear shed in silence. Before my near-death experience, I had always viewed suffering as a punishment, as something to be feared and avoided at all costs. Pain was an enemy. Trials were obstacles to overcome as quickly as possible. And faith was supposed to take the suffering away. At least, that's what I had thought. But in that in-between place, as I watched angels moving among the living, I saw the truth. Suffering did not weaken faith. It refined it. I saw it as clearly as I saw my own broken body lying on the ground below me. The individuals who carried the mark of God, those whose souls had been touched by His love, glowed with the divine light. Some flickered gently, their faith still growing, still uncertain. But others shone with a brilliance so intense it was almost blinding, their souls radiating a light that pierced the very darkness around them. And those were the ones who had suffered the most. I watched as angels surrounded a man sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, his head buried in his hands. His body trembled with grief, his heart breaking under the weight of loss. He had just said goodbye to his wife, the woman he had loved for more than 40 years. The pain was raw, unrelenting, an agony that no words could soothe. And yet, as I looked closer, I saw something incredible. His mark burned brighter than ever. It was not because he was free from suffering. It was because he had chosen to hold on to faith despite it. An angel stood beside him, not removing his sorrow, but strengthening him through it. The angel's presence was like a steady hand on his shoulder, a silent whisper of encouragement, a reminder that he was not alone. I could feel the weight of God's love pressing into him, filling the empty spaces where grief had hollowed him out. And though he could not see it, I could. His pain was not diminishing his light. It was making it stronger. This realization shook me. I had always prayed for suffering to end, for struggles to be taken away. But here, in this space between worlds, I saw that the struggles themselves were part of something greater. I turned my gaze and saw a young woman sitting on the floor of a small apartment, unpaid bills scattered around her, tears running silently down her face. She had spent years trying to build a life, only to face failure after failure. She was exhausted, worn down, at the edge of despair. And yet, the angels did not remove her struggles. Instead, one of them knelt beside her, whispering unseen words into her soul. I saw the way her breath hitched, the way her shoulders straightened ever so slightly, as if she had felt something real, something powerful. The angel was not taking her suffering away, but was giving her the strength to endure it. And as she took a deep breath and wiped her tears, I saw her mark glow just a little brighter. The weight of what I was witnessing settled into me like a revelation I had always known but never understood. Suffering was not a sign of abandonment. It was an opportunity, a sacred moment where faith could either wither or grow into something unshakable. My mind flashed back to my own life, to the times I had struggled, the nights I had cried out in frustration and despair, asking why. Why did God allow such pain? Why did He not take it away? Had I known then what I knew now, I would have asked a different question. What is He strengthening in me through this? Because that was what I saw. Faith was not proven in times of ease, but in the fire of hardship. I looked again and saw a mother sitting in a church pew, her hands clasped in desperate prayer for her son who had lost his way. She had spent years pleading with God, begging for a miracle, waiting for an answer. And still, she waited. An angel stood beside her, not removing her burden, but adding to her strength. I saw how her prayers, though unanswered in the way she had hoped, were weaving golden threads that connected her to her son, threads that would not break even in his darkest moments. She did not know it yet, but her suffering was shaping something beautiful, something eternal. And then I saw myself. I saw every moment of pain I had ever endured, every loss, every failure, every unanswered prayer. I saw the nights I had doubted, the days I had questioned whether God was listening at all. And then I saw the truth. Every hardship had been met with unseen hands steadying me, guiding me, strengthening me in ways I had never recognized. The suffering I had resented, the struggles I had wished away. These were the very things that had shaped my faith, that had made my soul burn brighter. As this revelation settled within me, another question arose. If suffering was meant to strengthen faith, then what of the future? Would faith endure in a world growing darker, or would it be swallowed by the shadows? I had always wondered about the future. What would become of the world? Would faith endure, or would it fade into nothingness under the weight of darkness? In life, I had often felt uncertainty creeping into my heart, a quiet whisper that asked if the struggles, the prayers, the suffering, and the hope were all worth it. But in that place, between life and eternity, I was shown the answer. It came to me as a vision, vast and powerful, stretching beyond time itself. I was no longer merely an observer, but a witness to something so profound that it reshaped everything I had ever believed about what was to come. The world was dark, darker than I had ever seen it before. Shadows stretched across the land, creeping into every corner, twisting and consuming. It was not just the absence of light, it was the weight of despair, the force of everything that sought to silence truth and drown love in fear. There were wars, not only of nations, but of hearts, battles unseen, waged in the depths of human souls. People wandered aimlessly, seeking meaning in things that could never satisfy. Hope, for many, was a distant memory. But then I saw them. Scattered throughout the darkness, like torches against the night, were the marked ones. Their light did not flicker or wane. It grew. With every challenge, with every trial, their marks became stronger, brighter. They were not consumed by the darkness around them. No, they stood against it. The faithful shone like stars, and as I watched, I realized the truth. The darker the world became, the more vital their light was. It was as if the pressure of the times, the weight of suffering, did not crush them but refined them, making them glow all the more. These were the ones who had chosen faith despite fear, love despite hatred, hope despite despair. They were warriors, not with weapons, but with unwavering trust in something greater than themselves. I turned to the angel beside me, their presence radiant with the peace of God, and I understood. They were showing me this not to frighten me, but to prepare me. What happens to them? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The angel lifted a hand, and suddenly everything shifted. I was no longer watching the world. Instead, I was standing in a place so filled with light, so saturated with joy, that I felt my entire being tremble in awe. Heaven. Before me stretched a gathering so vast I could not see where it ended. Millions upon millions stood together, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that could never be found on earth. They were dressed in brilliant garments, their very presence exuding peace, victory, and fulfillment beyond anything I had ever known. And then the music began. It was not like music I had heard before. Every note was alive, every melody woven with something sacred. It was as if all of creation had joined together in a single glorious song, a song of triumph, of love, of eternity fulfilled. This was the grand celebration. These were the faithful, the ones who had endured, the ones who had carried their light through the darkness and now stood in glory. I wept, not from sorrow, but from the sheer beauty of it. These were the souls who had been marked by God, not because of their perfection, not because they had never failed, but because they had believed. They had held on. They had chosen Him even when the world told them not to. And now, they stood victorious. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision faded. The music, the light, the overwhelming joy, all of it slipped away, pulling me back toward the world I had left behind. The first thing I remember when I opened my eyes was the sound. A steady, rhythmic beeping, soft voices murmuring around me, the distant hum of machines keeping me tethered to this world. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling above me was white, the lights too bright, and the smell, antiseptic and sterile, filled my lungs with every shallow breath I took. I was back. A rush of sensations overwhelmed me. Pain, exhaustion, the weight of my body pressing into the hospital bed. But beneath all of that, there was something else. A whisper of something greater. A memory not just of what had happened, but of what I had seen. The marks. My heart pounded as I turned my head slowly, my body still weak from the trauma it had endured. My eyes scanned the room, searching, hoping. But the radiant, divine markings that I had once seen so clearly, the glowing threads that had connected souls, the brilliant light that had pulsed from the faithful, were no longer there. At least, not in the way I had seen them before. But I knew they were still there. I could feel them, lingering like a presence just beyond the edges of my vision, just beyond the physical reality that surrounded me. Though my earthly eyes could no longer perceive them in vivid light, my soul recognized their presence. I turned my head slightly and saw a nurse adjusting the IV beside my bed. She had been there for hours, tending to me with quiet patience, offering soft reassurances even though I had not yet been fully awake to hear them. And though I could not see the mark on her as I once had, I knew it was there. I felt the kindness radiating from her, a warmth beyond what simple human care could offer. She wasn't just tending to my body. She was offering something greater. It was in that moment that I understood. The marks, the divine connections, the glowing manifestations of faith and love, they had never disappeared. They had simply been woven into the fabric of this world, hidden in the kindness of a stranger, in the whispered prayers of the faithful, in the unseen miracles that happened every single day. I closed my eyes, exhaustion pulling at me, but my heart swelled with something deeper than any pain I felt. God's work had never ceased. Faith was still moving, still spreading, still touching the lives of those who chose to believe, even if they could not see it as I once had. As the days passed and my body slowly healed, I found myself watching people more closely. I observed not just their words or actions, but the quiet moments in between. The way a father comforted his frightened child in the waiting room. The way a janitor hummed a hymn under his breath as he mopped the hospital floors. The way an elderly woman pressed her hands together in silent prayer before receiving her medication. There, in those seemingly ordinary moments, I recognized the divine at work. Before my near-death experience, I had thought of miracles as something grand, something extraordinary that defied logic and the natural order of things. But now, I realized that the true miracles had always been unfolding in the most unexpected places, in the smallest acts of love, in the simplest gestures of faith. I no longer needed to see the marks to know they existed. I could feel them in the warmth of a prayer spoken in faith. I could hear them in the quiet encouragement of someone lifting up another in kindness. I could witness them in the perseverance of those who held on to hope despite suffering. God's presence was everywhere. It always had been. I had just never known how to look for it before. As soon as I was strong enough, I began speaking about what I had seen. At first, I wasn't sure how people would react. Would they believe me? Would they think I was imagining things, that my experience had been nothing more than the delusions of a dying mind? But I couldn't keep silent. I had seen heaven's work. I had felt God's love move through the prayers of the faithful, through the unseen threads that bound people together. I had watched as suffering refined faith rather than destroyed it, and I had stood in awe as the light of those who endured glowed brighter than the darkness that surrounded them. How could I not share that? And so I did. I told my family first. My mother wept as she listened, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. My father, a quiet man of simple faith, nodded with glistening eyes, as if he had always known deep down that what I was saying was true. Then, I told my friends. Some listened with open hearts, leaning in, eager to understand. Others were hesitant, unsure. But even those who doubted couldn't deny the change in me. I wasn't the same person who had crashed on that highway, the same woman who had clung to life for 8 long minutes before returning. I had seen something. I had been somewhere. And I had come back different. As word spread, I was invited to speak to others. At churches, in small groups, to people who had lost their way, to those who had suffered and wondered if God had forgotten them. And with every conversation, every retelling, I watched something shift. People began to see. Not as I had. Not with eyes that could perceive divine light, but with hearts that started to recognize God's presence in the world around them. They began to pray more, to love more, to see the unseen in the everyday. And that was enough. Even now, years later, I sometimes close my eyes and remember the way the marks once glowed so vividly before me. There are moments when I wish I could see them again, when I long to witness the divine as I had in those few fleeting moments between life and eternity. But then, I remind myself, I don't need to see them anymore. I see them in different ways now. I see them in the stranger who buys a meal for someone in need without expecting anything in return. I see them in the mother who prays for her child long after they've fallen asleep. I see them in the hands of a doctor who fights tirelessly to save a patient, even when the odds are against them. I see them in the quiet faith of those who refuse to give up hope, even in the darkest of times. And I see them in myself, in the way I love deeper, pray harder, believe more fiercely than I ever did before. Because I know the truth now. The marks were never about what I could see. They were about what I was willing to believe. And belief, true, unwavering faith, has the power to illuminate even the darkest of worlds. I don't know why I was given the chance to see beyond the veil, why I was allowed to witness the marks and the work of angels. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I know this. I was sent back with a purpose. To tell you that you are never beyond God's love. To tell you that the divine is at work, even when you can't see it. To tell you that your prayers, your faith, your kindness, they all matter. And to remind you that even if you don't see the marks, they are still there. All you have to do is believe.